Isaac is a journalist and also an entrepreneur and a real expert on China. He speaks Mandarin, lived in Beijing for quite some time. And he wrote a book called, well, first I'll talk about your company. He has a company called Strategy Risks, which really works with companies to help them understand how to deal with US-China issues. But he also wrote a book called America Second. And what's the subtitle?
How American elites are making China stronger.
How American elites are making China stronger. So I guess it would not be wrong to call you an alarmist.
I would push back on that term.
Okay.
I'd say a realist.
Okay, well, what's your general view? Let's just get some summaries going here.
So the US and China are on a path towards war. Hopefully this won't happen. It very possibly might. And Americans and Chinese corporations are very much not prepared for this potential eventuality.
Well, what about citizens, man? I mean, you know, when you say we're on a path toward war, is this primarily about Taiwan?
It's primarily about the US and China not being able to figure out how to both work together. I remember talking to a Chinese official several years ago who described China and America as neighbors. And as China got wealthier and wealthier, their house kept expanding and expanding, and America's house stayed stagnant. And so how are these two neighbors going to deal with each other? I think there's massive ethical risks that don't come into conversation because people are afraid about talking about war. The US has a terrible history of Japanese-American internments, of Germans during World War I, and because we're not having a conversation about what happens if the US and China go to war, we're also not having the conversation about how do we protect the rights of Chinese and Chinese Americans. More damningly, Beijing has a far worse reputation on all of these fronts, and what are American companies going to do when their thousands of Chinese employees start getting rounded up in China because they worked for an American company?
Well, and inversely, how many Americans are in China?
Hundreds of thousands.
Hundreds of thousands of Americans are in China. So presumably, wouldn't there be if we did round up Chinese and Chinese Americans, which would be an awful lot of people to round up. I mean, let's face it, that sounds scary. I mean, you're like almost the first person I've ever heard even mention that risk. And I suppose you've probably found yourself in many contexts where you are the first person mentioning that risk. And you've been promoting your book and talking about it now for quite some time. What's the reaction you get from all kinds of people, including Chinese Americans, when you say that?
So there's a radical amount of diversity among Chinese Americans. So a lot of them are very pro-Beijing, a lot of them are very anti-Beijing. And I think part of the problem with this conversation is that, and I'll answer your question in a second, but it tends to be a lot of old white men or, middle-aged or young white men having this conversation. And there needs to be a lot of different voices debating how the US should deal with China. I get a lot of disbelief, I get a lot of shock. Sometimes I get pushback, sometimes I get, oh, I never thought of that. That seems like something we should really address.
Well, okay, I mean, how should we address that kind of stuff? I mean, what would you like to see happen?
I'd like to see people say, I don't think we should go to war with China, or I think we will have to go defend Taiwan, or regardless of what happens, this may happen. And so here's how we improve civil liberties. Here's how we improve our defense. Here's from a corporate strategy, how we reduce our exposure. Here's how we train our people to understand these things. And here's how we have this conversation. It's a very challenging conversation to have because it hits upon so many sensitive political and racial issues, but we have to have the language to converse on this.
Okay, well, let's step back a little bit, and I think maybe in the Q&A we can get deeper into that, because I have a feeling a lot of people have questions about some of this. But when you call your book America Second, the implication is there is a large community in the US that has essentially been advancing Chinese interests over American interests. What led you to that conclusion?
So when I came back from living in Beijing about 10 years ago, I was stunned to hear so many prominent Americans talk about China, not the way Chinese people do, which is incredibly diverse, but the way that Communist Party officials do. And they'd repeat phrases like, China has 5,000 years of history, and China's lifted hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. And they'd be in these intellectual ruts.
That's the kind of thing I say. Huh? Keep going, keep going.
And the issue with these phrases is not their veracity, it's that we've been unknowingly repeating Chinese Communist Party propaganda. And I've said these phrases for a long time too. And I would later on draw the comparison between these phrases and the phrases all lives matter. So if I asked you 20 years ago, do all lives matter? You'd say, yeah, it's a silly question, of course, sure, why not? If I asked you now, you would almost certainly say no, and you'd...
Well, you certainly say, I don't want to use that phrase because that's not an appropriate phrase to use.
Exactly,
right?
But 20 years ago, it had no sting. 100 years ago, you say you're a national socialist, people say, great, you're national and a socialist.
Okay, so what's an analogy here?
The analogy is that you're repeating Communist Party propaganda, just like if you say all lives matter, you're repeating a Republican talking point. You identify as a national socialist, you're identifying as a Nazi.
So what if I'm saying Chinese have brought 500 million people out of poverty, which is a fact, and even if that's echoing Chinese government propaganda, what's wrong with that if it's a fact?
So do lives matter?
Yes, they do.
Do all of them matter?
Yes, they do.
Do all lives matter?
I guess you're making a verbal point, but I don't know what.
Well, that's a fact.
Yeah.
I think the issue is that when you say China has lifted hundreds of millions of people out of poverty, you're implying that the Communist Party has done that, as opposed to, well, Chinese people, despite the Communist Party, have worked really hard to improve their lives, and the Communist Party put hundreds of millions of people in poverty at the same time. China has 5,000 years of history. Similar phrase. Yes, it does, and the party wants you to think that they are the apotheosis of Chinese history, that they're the great realization of what China has been doing for so long, as opposed to just a blip in 1.4% of the history.
So I'm a little confused, though, and I've got so many questions to ask you in so little time. For example, I want to talk about TSMC for one thing. But looking at these sort of multiple points you're making, on the one hand, you're saying we need a more rational domestic dialogue in order to be better prepared for the possibility of conflict, in order to avoid excessive overreaction, in a sense, right? But you're also saying, and you didn't like being called an alarmist, but that I guess effectively the disagreements, the intrinsic conflict between China and the US is deeper and more profound than most of us generally acknowledge. Okay?
I think that's a great summation.
So what do we do about that latter point? I mean, is there something we can do as citizens, as business people, to reduce that chasm that has developed politically, to some extent economically, between the US and China?
So from a risk perspective, corporations can have a far better understanding of how exposed they are to the Chinese Communist Party and work to reduce that. On an individual perspective, representative democracy and voting, I think it's very important to mention that if one believes that Congress reflects the will of the people, Congress is incredibly anti-CCP, and it's very important to I don't want to say police the language that we use, but to be very mindful of what we're talking about. I never think that I'm anti-China, just like you can be anti-Trump but pro-American. It's a very simple...
Well, it actually is very analogous to the dialogue about Israel. If you are someone who believes in human rights and you think yourself as a human rights champion, it's very easy for someone to say you're anti-Semitic.
Right.
I mean, it gets really quickly goes right to the really negative interpretation. So it's analogous. But so you're saying on the one hand, we shouldn't be anti-China. You're saying that.
I'm saying we should be anti-CCP. Or actually, I'm saying people should have their own opinions and share them. I'm anti-CCP, but that doesn't mean other people should be.
One of the things that's interesting that you pointed out, which insanely ignorant me didn't really remember, was that China doesn't have an army. Explain that.
So, like Vietnam, like North Korea, China has no army. The Chinese Communist Party has an army. The People's Liberation Army is the armed wing of the Chinese Communist Party. So when you're working with Bank of China or ICBC or any Chinese state entity, you're also working with the military. They're part of the same family. And you can think about this
So it's like Iran
American,
in that way almost, yeah.
Similar, but this is very official. So this is not, the army serves the party. It's the army is part of the party. So imagine if the Republicans had their own army and the head of the Ohio National Guard was the Ohio representative of the Republican Army. So that's how it is in China.
Okay, I'm just going to keep going back to, so what do we do? I mean, maybe the big question I have is, can we defuse tensions while the Communist Party remains in power?
So it depends who we are in this. There's an old Chinese expression that I think of a lot with these kind of things, which is a praying mantis waving its hands in front of a chariot. It's the idea that you can't fuck with fate is a colloquial translation. I think if you say, I really don't think that the US and China should go to war, there's a lot that you can do to do that. If you think, I think this might happen anyway, I need to prepare for it. I think the other issue is so often people who try to diffuse tensions end up making very strong ethical compromises because they work with Beijing or they work with the Chinese.
And this is sort
Party.
of the, you know, what do they call it? The something guard inside the U.S. that was, you know, I forget the, but that's the hidden army of China in among, you know, like I think you might think Kissinger is among those people, right?
I think Kissinger for the last 40 years has been an agent of Chinese influence. Kissinger disagrees with this assessment.
Have you ever had a chance to discuss it with him?
His lawyers had some thoughts, but not him as an individual. And it's lovely being in a country where the First Amendment is so strong, and it was lovely to see Knopf's lawyers write a very, very polite, measured fuck you to the doctor. So that was a pleasure to see.
Okay, so keep the swearing down. I sometimes do it. It's not ideal on our stage. But so what, I guess I just want to keep talking a little more about what should we do. Obviously, we want to defuse tensions. We want to all rise together. We want to have a global harmony. We want to fight climate. And we need to collaborate and cooperate to fight climate. So how do we think about that set of challenges?
So 2 points on that. First, I would strongly disagree with the idea that we need to cooperate to fight climate. I think if you think climate change is the biggest risk that the US and China face, why does it then follow that the US should partner with China to fight climate change? Because whenever that happens, Beijing will continuously move the goalposts. And if they are in any ways a rational actor, they'll also want to fight climate change. So I think there's this idea that, oh, we should make all these sacrifices so that China does something in its best interest. And if they don't, they're going to passive aggressively build coal plants. I think we forget that we often have a lot more leverage with the stick side of the equation than the carrot. I think on the general point of what we should do, a lot of it is really about fighting corruption. The foreign policy world is far less comfortable with ideas about conflicts of interest. So David introduced me as a journalist. I mostly run a consulting firm. I work with big companies and help them reduce their China risk. The companies that I work with, I'm far less likely to publicly criticize. So I have a lot of the conflicts of interests that I describe. I also self-censor in both my private and public conversations. So keep that in mind as you listen to me and hear what I'm
But you would
about to
say we all do, to some degree, right?
To some degree, and it's also, Chinese people are much more comfortable saying things about people's bodily appearance. And I remember being there and someone, a friend of mine saying, "Hey, Isaac, great to see you. You got fat, huh?" And I just blanched. And she realized her faux pas and said, "Oh, like it must be that new sweater." And so I think some self-censorship is good. I think it's the lubrication about our conversations with the world. And I think it's a question of degree. I think I'm about to go to Beijing, and so I'm not going to tweet the story is problematic and incredibly common. But I think some of it, I think it's just it's a lot of individual monitoring. But for so long, former heads of the cabinet, and still today, former heads of the cabinet will leave office, open a consulting firm, get paid tens of thousands of dollars a month from various companies to act as door openers, and then suppress criticism about those countries. And I think it's far more problematic with China because of the threat that China and the Chinese Communist Party pose to the US, and also because of China's human rights abuses. So the people I focus on in the book, mostly Henry Kissinger, but it is very bipartisan. I also talk a lot about Madeleine Albright, whose company used to consult for a Chinese weapons manufacturer. And you just kind of think, how is it appropriate for an icon of democracy to be supporting AVIC, which is a Chinese weapons company?
One of the things I've often said about China, which is also inarguably true, is that the technocratic leadership of China is among the most engineering savvy, digitally savvy, computer industry savvy, and just generally more methodical and scientific in their thinking about risk and opportunity. Until I think the previous standing committee, all the members of the standing committee were PhD engineers, whereas we have, in fact, I think it was during Hu Jintao that not only were all the members of the standing committee PhD engineers, but all their wives were also PhD engineers. It was one recent period when that was the case. And, whereas we have all these half-baked bad lawyers running our country, right, who don't have a big picture view, don't understand how systems work. There is something about China where they really are systems thinkers in a way we always talk like we should be, right? Is that something you accept?
No, I think I always push back on the idea that there's one or two things that explain China or Chinese people. I think we have to be careful with that kind of thinking because, again, it's a radically diverse place, and there's a lot of people who feel and think very differently, a lot of people who feel and think very similarly. And it reminds me of the idea, so Kim Jong-un, the North Korean dictator, I think we talked about this, studied in Switzerland, and people thought, oh, would he become a liberal force because of those Western ideas? And there's so many dictators who have studied in American or Western universities, not least to mention Adolf Hitler, who studied in Austria. I think the other issue is that we have this Orientalist idea that the Chinese are playing the long game, that they're thinking really far ahead. And I think the country would be so much less successful if people actually thought in decades. I don't know any Chinese person who thinks that way. I don't know any Americans who think that way. And I'm always afraid of people saying, oh, China's going to seize Taiwan by 2049. Maybe. I'm a lot more worried about the next year or two. Or, oh, China, there's a former standing committee member who said China's going to be a democracy in 2047. Great. I mean, he's going to be dead by then, and who knows? We don't have the ability to think that far in the future, and we have to be careful about ascribing that.
Okay, I want to go to the audience because I'm sure people have comments and questions, but summarize what we should do about this in like 2 sentences.
Understand your exposure to the Communist Party, work to reduce it, and be kind to Americans and Chinese Americans.
Okay, that's reasonable. Okay, who has a comment or a question? Okay, right here. And please identify yourself.
Okay, I'm Curtis Nelson, and I understand that the CCP does human rights violations, as in take organs from people, slave sweatshops, and stuff like that. Is that accurate?
The organ harvesting is a very, very difficult thing to find out because that's mostly advanced by Falun Gong news sources who are sometimes credible, sometimes really not credible. So I'm really hoping that someone will do a very thorough study of that without using Falun Gong sources to determine. Falun Gong is a Chinese religion / cult. They run New Tang Dynasty, they run Epoch Times, and they have about the same level of media accuracy as a lot of Chinese state-owned publications. So it very well could be true, and the people of Falun Gong have suffered greatly at the hands of the Chinese Communist Party. It's just very difficult with some of their publications to separate fact and fiction.
Okay, interesting question. Back there, let's get the mic to this person here. Wait for the mic, please. Thank you. Okay. Go a little faster with those mics, guys, because we have very little time. Thank you. And then we'll go to this person.
Just out of curiosity, in certain technology industries.
Identify yourself, please.
Hi, I'm Bob Hariri from Cellularity in New Jersey.
Thank you.
Some industries like biotechnology, biopharma are heavily influenced by the talent that comes from China. In fact, at our company, I would say 30 to 40% of our scientists actually come from Asia, China being the predominant country. How much should we worry about things like technology creep and from things such as spying?
So glad you asked that. This is a thing. I've asked him about Facebook because I wrote a book about Facebook. I absolutely am certain there's major league infiltration, and he agrees.
And here's the other problem. The quality of the talent from Asia, I have to say, and I'm embarrassed to say this, exceeds what we are seeing domestically.
It's a very important question. It's another one that fits in that bucket of very difficult to discuss. The advice I always give is screen before you hire. And this is something that would have helped the Department of Justice's China initiative. It's much harder to say, hey, this visiting professor at MIT is an 80% chance of being a Chinese spy and litigating that publicly. That's not nearly high enough to ruin someone's life. It's much easier to say, oh, here's this person's resume. They lied on their resume. They left a 5-year blank where they didn't talk about going into PLA service. It doesn't mean they're an active spy now. The risks are high. Let me figure this out then. It's a very, very tricky question, and I think it is case by case. It also depends on how sensitive the technology, how much you're working with the US government. Do these doctors and engineers have very close ties to the Chinese state? It's a tricky one, but it's worth thinking about.
Hi, this is Vaibhav Parikh, a lawyer from India. We had discussion on this yesterday. India also has worries about China, and Indian government has taken some action. For example, any investment coming from countries surrounding India, which includes China, it's targeted at China, requires prior government approval before they can get invest, right? Whether directly or indirectly. Similarly, they banned a lot of softwares, including TikToks, have been banned. A lot of telecom equipments have been banned, and there have been several financial transactions which have been scrutinized. So government is taking, in that sense, China threat seriously. Of course, India and China went to war, so they have a more ability or credibility to do it. My question here is that, do you think US government, just not the US company, should call out the threat with China rather than keeping a blind eye or playing a soft thing, and take hard steps? Or do you think what currently government is doing, soft steps, is what they should continue?
Thank you.
I think they are.
I just have a variation.
We're really short on time, so we're going to have to call.
I think they are taking hard steps, and I've been impressed to see that, and they are very bipartisan. I'm glad you brought up TikTok. I just want to very quick on TikTok and Huawei. So if the US and China have peaceful relations, I'm not worried about Huawei and TikTok. If the US and China go to war, both Huawei and TikTok, and especially TikTok, will be very, very potent weapons against the United States.
Right.
And that's why TikTok's a national security
Do you
threat.
accept the theory that some have that the Chinese government's been attempting to establish a directory of all American citizens, a database of information about large numbers of American citizens for potential use down the road?
It's very believable, and I think it's like one of those things. So Grindr was briefly a Chinese company. That is deeply problematic, and the idea with risk is not, I have to know for a fact that the PLA, for example, had access to the Grindr accounts of the most prominent Americans. Knowing that it could happen means that it's a risk, and I think it's the same thing with a database. It's very believable. It's very possible. I haven't seen conclusive proof.
And we do have to wrap, but one of the reasons that I personally think there's a huge likelihood, because there was no screening for so many years, that a company like Facebook, Meta, has a large number of Chinese government agents inside now. And the same must be true of TSMC, because these companies are so central to the global economic system that having influence in them in the event of conflict would be so advantageous. It makes no sense whatsoever that, considering how easy it was for certain periods to put people in, that they would not have done it, because the Chinese government is very methodical and very analytically adept.
One of the things that makes this so complicated is the difficulty of defining what a Chinese agent is. So let's take universities. You have a classroom, there's 10 Chinese students. One of those Chinese students, every once in a while, will talk to another Chinese student in Tsinghua University. That Chinese student is a young pioneer, he's a party member, and this student in the American university will say, hey, this other student would ask all these difficult questions about Xinjiang. That's kind of interesting. What do you think? Does that mean this American student who's knowingly or unknowingly informing on another Chinese student, is he a Chinese agent? It's a very, very difficult question. It's very hard
I'm not
to know where
talking
to draw
about
the
that.
line.
I'm talking about paid people who are in the employ of intelligence agencies, of which we don't discuss enough how many there are from all nation states of power. So,
I certainly agree, and I think the question of, okay, so someone will occasionally have conversations with someone who works at a Chinese state company, and then that guy will pick up lunch and give a few $100s to him. That might be enough to be a Chinese agent. It's something we need to debate.
Unfortunately, the thing that's so scary about this is your point about avoiding discrimination against Chinese in the United States and Chinese Americans in the United States is so obviously important. And it's so hard to have these discussions without it seeming to also potentially impugn a Chinese presence, which we would otherwise welcome in all sorts of contexts. So this is a really much longer conversation. I apologize that we couldn't take more time with it, but I would recommend everyone read Isaac's book because he does spend 300 pages exploring all these questions. And I think it's important to have the discussion about U.S.-China relations because it is probably the single biggest flashpoint of danger in the world today, and we all have to be thinking about it harder. Would you accept that summary?
That I would very much agree.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Isaac, for being here.
Thank you, David. Appreciate it.